Or like,
What do I know about the Truman Doctrine?
on April 12th, 1945, Harry S. Truman ascended to the presidency. He would change the United States foreign policy with the Truman Doctrine. To understand the Truman Doctrine, we have to start at the beginning with the end of World War I. World War I ended in late 1918, and after 4 years of war and economic destruction, the United States was ready to thrive. More Americans left farm life and moved into cities. This era, known as the Roaring Twenties, was a time of prosperity, prohibition, and jazz music. In the 1920s, the United States had three Republican presidents: Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. Elected in 1920, Harding's presidency represented a return to normalcy. He died in 1923 after traveling to Alaska. Calvin Coolidge ascended to the presidency, and he had progressive beliefs such as his support for women's suffrage and the direct election of senators. He also believed in limited government. Herbert Hoover became president in 1929. He was already well known for providing famine relief during World War I. He was appointed by Woodrow Wilson to serve as the United States Food Administrator. However, it was under Hoover's watch when the Roaring Twenties ended and the Great Depression began. He failed to address the problem, and he tried ending it, but the United States turned against him, and he lost the 1932 election in a landslide to none other than Franklin Roosevelt. Serving an unprecedented 4 terms as president, FDR led the United States through the Great Depression and also World War II. In 1941, Roosevelt delivered his famous Four Freedoms speech, proposing 4 freedoms everyone should have. Those were freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. On April 12th, 1945, FDR passed away suddenly, and his vice president, Harry S. Truman, ascended to the presidency. At first, the American people expected Truman to fit into the mold of Roosevelt. Truman had to flip the script. A farmer from Missouri who rose the political ladder, Truman knew how to communicate with people, and he was a man of the people. After World War II, Europe was in ruins. By 1947, a new threat called communism was on the rise, and Greece and Turkey were the most vulnerable. They were the most vulnerable because there was a civil war in Greece against the Greek government and the Greek Communist Party. The Communist Party was trying to occupy and control Greece. And after World War II, Greece was liberated by the British and given aid for this Greek Civil War. The United States got involved because Britain announced that it would no longer provide aid to Greece and Turkey on March 31st, 1947. Previously, on March 5th, 1946, former Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered a speech in Fulton, Missouri, with President Truman. This speech was known as the Iron Curtain speech because Churchill accurately predicted the Cold War, which was still yet to come. He talked about the growing division between Western Europe and Eastern Europe because of the rise of communism, and he famously said,
"An iron curtain has descended across the continent."
As World War II ended, there was lots of uncertainty concerning the future of the United States. Truman's ascension to the presidency was a turning point because he changed the United States foreign policy with the Truman Doctrine.
The simple explanation for the Truman Doctrine is it was my grandfather's policy of the hedge against Soviet expansion. So supporting these countries, keeping them from turning communist. And of course, the Truman Doctrine was, I think, originally or afterwards known as aid to Greece and Turkey. Those were the two main
Yes.
countries that started all of this. So he gave aid to the democratic governments of Greece and Turkey to avoid a communist takeover.
However, it wasn't just Greece and Turkey that were at risk, but the rest of Eastern Europe was at risk because Eastern Europe was controlled by communist governments and they were at risk of a communist takeover. The mastermind behind the Truman Doctrine was George Kennan. Kennan was an advisor to Truman during the early stages of the Cold War. In 1946, he published an anonymous letter in the journal Foreign Affairs. This became known as the X Letter. He stated that the United States should be aggressive with the Soviets to contain communism. This is where Harry S. Truman comes in. Now that the British were no longer helping Greece and Turkey, Truman felt that the United States needed to do something, and on March 12, 1947, he delivered a speech to Congress, which was the introduction of the Truman Doctrine.
We must take immediate and resolute action. I therefore ask the Congress to provide authority for assistance to Greece and Turkey in the amount of $400 million for the period ending June 30th, 1948. In addition to funds, I ask the Congress to authorize the detail of American civilian and military personnel to Greece and Turkey at the request of those countries to assist in the tasks of reconstruction and for the purpose of supervising the use of such financial and material assistance as may be furnished.
With the Truman Doctrine, the United States was actively involved in foreign affairs and was moving away from isolationism, which was the foreign stance of the United States for most of the 1920s and 30s.
With the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich, he learned that taking everything from a country, crushing it, is not the way to go. Better to build them up, turn them into friends, make them democratic, if you can, make them democratic, give them their lives back, give them their livelihood, make them successful. The more success you have, the more people have, the more people have homes, food, medical care, less chance of war.
The Truman Doctrine worked. It worked because it led to other things such as the Marshall Plan and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO.
Well, NATO, this all happened at around the same time,
Yes.
and for the same reasons. Truman Doctrine being more of a direct aid to countries that were embattled. NATO, my grandfather likened to a group of neighbors with mutual interests,
Yes.
allied against a rotten landlord.
Mm-hmm.
These are, you have strength and safety in numbers.
Yeah.
You can band together, pool your resources. The idea of NATO was that should one country be attacked, the others would come to its defense in a variety of ways.
The Marshall Plan was essentially the same thing as the Truman Doctrine, but for Western Europe. Western Europe at this time in 1948 was heavily destroyed from World War II, and the Marshall Plan industrialized Western Europe and brought back Western Europe's economy. Similarly to the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan's goal was also to help contain communism. The Marshall Plan was the first of many U.S. foreign aid programs, and it really helped advance the concept of foreign policy in the United States. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan drastically changed foreign policy. They showed that going forward, the United States would be involved in world problems and not be an isolationist country as it was in the 1920s. While communism was contained, Soviet tensions were rising, leading up to the Cold War in 1947. The Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan are still important today. U.S. aid is a modern-day version of the Marshall Plan. Established in 1961, U.S. aid is a federal agency that is in charge of relief efforts over natural disasters and wars. The Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan helped advance aid and foreign policy, and it still matters today. The debate continues. What is America's responsibility?